Hello, and welcome to your Week 11 lecture video. This week we're going to look at network security. So we're going to look at different types of security threats and vulnerabilities, some network attacks or vulnerabilities, how to mitigate against those, and how to secure your devices. This is an intro to a lot of these concepts. We're going to go into the Cisco specifics for a lot of these, but intro level stuff. So, threats and vulnerabilities. Attacks on networks can result in downtime, cost the company money. It could be data loss, either important information or other assets, and the result is bad, right? Attackers can gain access through software vulnerabilities, hardware attacks, guessing somebody's username and password. This is why you tend to not use defaults and change them as much as possible, right? Intruders who gain access by modifying software or exploiting software vulnerabilities are called threat actors. I'm not crazy about that wording, but it works. After the attacker has gained access to the network, there's a variety of different types of threats that may arise, and you tend to see more than one of these in conjunction with the others. They might steal some information theft. They might steal somebody's identity theft. They might steal some data or manipulate some data within your system so it's no longer accurate. And they might disrupt your service. Now, disruption of service is usually coupled with any of the above. If they steal some information, steal some data, or manipulate stuff, well, if they manipulate stuff, probably not. But if they're stealing stuff, they're probably going to disrupt the service after they've gotten everything that they want, just to kind of cover their tracks, or an attempt to cover their tracks. Now, a vulnerability in hacking terms, or security terms, is a degree of weakness within a network or a device. There's always going to be some degree of vulnerability inherent with everything. Routers, switches, desktops, servers, even security devices themselves. You can't make a network completely free of any type of vulnerabilities. The only way to do that is to put it in a cave and disconnect it from the internet, at which point why are you building a network, right? Now, typically, we tend to only worry about our endpoints because those are the ones that are most common to be attacked. So your endpoints are things like your servers, your desktops, laptops, whatever. And there's three primary types of vulnerabilities. Technical ones. So these could include weaknesses in some of the protocols in the TCP/IP stack, an operating system weakness, or a network equipment weakness. So an example of one of these that you're going to have to Google would be Heartbleed. Was a big thing probably about 10 years ago, and it was a vulnerability in the OpenSSL library. And yeah, it was fixed fairly quickly after it was detected, but it had existed and gone undetected for years. And that's true with a lot of the protocols that we tend to use, because they're all based on things that came before. And when we were first designing networks, I say we, but I wasn't there, back in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't anything like the world is today, right? Everyone wasn't interconnected and had a device in their hand that got you on the internet. It was just a very different mentality. So they weren't worried about security at all. And sometimes some of those protocols, in the way that they're implemented, even though the security has been layered on later, people can find an underlying thing that can be leveraged and exploited. That happens all the time. Other types of vulnerabilities you could have configuration vulnerabilities. So you might have an unsecured user account, or system accounts with easily guessed passwords, default passwords, right? I've talked this semester a little bit about when you go through in the labs, you're using the same password Cisco in class on through all the labs, right? And you're going to do that throughout all of the Cisco curriculum. But when you go out and work in industry, maybe don't use Cisco in class, right? It's an easy trap to fall into because you've done it for 4 years now, or 4 years, 2 years, 4 semesters, or 6 semesters, depending on which program you're in. And now you go out in industry, and you fall into that trap. Or possibly 1 year, because you could be in the computer repair and maintenance certificate. Forgot about that one. Either way, you might have misconfigured services that are on the internet. You could have unsecured default settings. Yeah, default settings right there, right? Think your home network as well, right? You pull it out of the box, plug it in, turn it on for your home router. That's what most people do. Probably not a good idea. You might want to go in and change some of those defaults. You could have misconfigured network equipment. There's a handy page I'll show you at the end of this if I remember on Wikipedia where they list all of the major cybersecurity breaches going back for I don't know how long, quite a long time. But what I like about this particular list, and if I don't show it to you, look it up. What I like about this list is it lists the number of records or customers compromised in the attack, and the source, and the number of times it's accidentally published on the internet or lost or stolen media. Crazy high, scary. That sort of thing happens all the time. Now another type of vulnerability or weakness could be in your security policies themselves. You might not have a security policy, or it might be badly written. You might have politics surrounding the security policy, or lack of authentication continuity, logical access not applied properly, software and hardware installations that weren't configured or were changed not in accordance with the policy. And you should have a disaster recovery plan, right? What happens if you're hacked? What happens if you get hit by malware? That's not the one I was thinking of, ransomware. What happens if your building gets struck by lightning or catches fire or something like that, right? Outside of just the standard things. You should have an on-site backup, and you should also have an off-site backup. If your company gets hit by ransomware and your only option is to pay the attackers, and you're the guy who is responsible for security, or girl, I probably want to start working on that resume. Just saying. Now, any of these attacks could leave the network or device open to a variety of other attacks, including malicious code, network attacks, right? Once they're in, they can do whatever else they want to do. Physical security is something that we need to think about more. And if they can be physically compromised, then they can just deny the use of those resources. These are categorized into 4 classes as well. Hardware threats, including physical damages to servers, routers, switches, cabling, workstations, etc. Environmental threats, environmental extremes, right? If it's too hot or too cold or too humid or too dry, that can cause physical damage to your equipment. So if you've got controls for that and they're on the internet, well, it's probably your first mistake, right? And don't do that. Electrical threats, voltage spikes, insufficient power supplies, unconditioned power or total power loss. You always want to have a backup power. And maintenance threats, so poor handling of electrical components, lack of spare parts, poor cabling, poor labeling. You have to have a plan for your physical security, and it has to be created and implemented to address all of these issues. Also, something not mentioned here, like if I can walk in off the street and claim that I'm somebody that I'm not and get access to your device, and I think I've used that example in the labs a few times, and if not, ask me this week in the lab. That way I'll know you watched my video too. If I can walk in off the street and just get access to your device without having to prove who I am, then maybe you need to work on your physical security a bit. So now we're going to talk about different types of attacks. Say different types of malware. Malware is short for malicious software. It's software code specifically designed to damage, disrupt, steal, or inflict some kind of negative action, right, on data, hosts, or networks. They tend to be broadly categorized into viruses, worms, and Trojan horses. Viruses are a type of malware that propagate by inserting a copy of itself into and becoming part of another program, and then it spreads from one computer to another as that program is installed or moved around, leaving infections as it travels. I guess kind of like COVID, only for computers. Worms are similar to viruses, except they self-replicate functional copies of themselves, and they can cause some really serious types of damage. So unlike viruses, which require spreading an infected file, worms can do this on their own. They don't need any help. Trojan horses they're like the Trojan horse from Greek mythology. They're harmful software that look like legitimate software. Unlike viruses and worms, they don't reproduce by infecting other files. They self-replicate. They have to be spread through user interaction, such as opening an email or downloading and running an illegitimate file from the internet that's been infected, and then your system is infected. Now, on top of those, there's also reconnaissance attacks. And there's three different categories of these. Or network attacks, I guess, could be classified into three of these categories. Reconnaissance attacks, so this is to deal with the discovery and mapping of systems, services, or vulnerabilities. They're looking for information. Access attacks, they're unauthorized, they have gained unauthorized access, user privileges to your systems, and are able to possibly manipulate data, or any of the above. Denial of service attacks, this is disabling or corrupting your network, bringing it offline. Possibly not offline completely, but inaccessible for others. For reconnaissance attacks, external threat attackers can use tools such as NSLOOKUP and WHOIS to determine the IP address space that your company has, and once they've figured that out, they can just start poking around at that range of IPs to figure out what addresses are active. I was actually reading something that was really interesting several months ago. I'll see if I can find it for you later, where you can actually detect what operating system is involved based on the information, or what operating system is involved, what operating system is installed on a remote device, based on the response time in a ping command. They all have specific response times within ranges, which is really interesting because that gives you a lot of information. I'm not sure how that's going to be changed. And that's one of those things I was talking a few slides back about. Vulnerabilities could be undetected in systems for years. Well, that's one such thing, right? There was probably a standard that was put in place in various different operating systems way back once upon a time, just based on the way ping was implemented in that operating system, and nobody thought about it. And why would you? And how would you change that? I don't know. Yeah. So access attacks exploit known vulnerabilities in your authentication services, FTP and web services, and then they gain entry into those accounts and other sensitive information. And they can be classified into four different types. Password attacks, so these are implemented using brute force, Trojan horses, or packet sniffers, or a combination thereof. Brute forcing passwords, Well, mitigating against those pretty easy, usually two-factor authentication. But that's not necessarily a manual thing. You can get software that'll do that. Trust exploitation. So the actor compromises a system within your organization and then uses that as the host to compromise other systems within your organization. I remember several years ago I was at an open source conference where there was a guy who was talking about, it was a cybersecurity consultant. He was talking about a company he'd been called in to investigate after a hack and find out what had happened. And it turned out in the course of his investigation, looking through system logs and analyzing what had happened, that the company had actually been hacked 2.5 years before they knew they were hacked. And in that 2.5 years, when they were in the systems, they were just gathering information. And once they'd gathered everything they wanted, they brought the whole network down. And that's when the company realized, hey, there's a problem. So, it's a real thing. Port redirection. So this is where a threat actor has a system that they've compromised within your network, and they use that as a base of attack for other targets. So they could redirect ports, incoming ports from one host to another, and then access services that they shouldn't have access. Man-in-the-middle attack. So they're positioned between two legitimate entities, and they can read or modify the data that passes between them. And generally they do a bit of both. And denial of service attacks. These are the ones you hear about the most, and they're the most difficult to eliminate. They're pretty easy to implement, and they cause a lot of damage. So they deserve special attention. They take on many forms. Usually you hear more of a DDoS, a distributed denial of service attack. But they all have the same goal. They prevent authorized people from using services that they're supposed to have access to. To help prevent against these, just keep up to date with patches, right? Keep your systems up to date and secure. Install updates regularly. That'll help a lot. They're a major risk because they interrupt your communication, they bring your network down. Time is money, that's the business adage, right? And they're pretty easy to conduct. A distributed denial of service attack is similar to a denial of service attack, but a denial of service attack usually comes from a single host. A distributed denial of service comes from multiple hosts, and it's coordinated. Usually somebody builds a botnet of infected hosters called zombies, or a network of zombies is a botnet. I just used that word. There you go. And then they use those to carry out a coordinated attack on a particular target. IoT devices are great for this because their security is usually crap. So, all of these things are scary, scary things. Your job as a network administrator is going to be, in some respect, mitigating against these. You're probably going to have a security team that comes in and helps, but in the age of cloud, that's what we're in, right? Security is part of your job as an admin now, right? Even just a little bit. Still probably have a security team that specializes in things and double checks, but you got to know a little bit. So secure your devices, your routers, your switches, your servers, your hosts. A lot of organizations use a defense in-depth approach or a layered approach. I like to refer to it as an onion, right? Security has layers, onions have layers, ogres have layers. If you've seen Shrek, you'll understand that reference. So you've got a combination of devices and services working in tandem, right? You don't just have one device you stick in and you're like, yeah, we're nice and secure now, right? No. You've got multiple other lines of defense. So you could have VPNs for remote access. You could have hardware firewall appliances, which would be in between the internet and the rest of your network. You could have intrusion prevention or intrusion detection systems. You could have email security, email security, email security and web security appliances. These are Cisco devices that you can purchase. They're not cheap, but they're worth it, and you can do some awesome things with them. And you're going to have some form of authentication server. Could be a Cisco AAA server. It could be Active Directory. Commonly, it's Active Directory. You have all of these things, right? When it comes to backing up your devices, keeping your configurations and your data backed up is one of the best ways to protect against data loss. If something goes down, you just put a new thing in, restore it, back up, reimage it, whatever, and you're good to go again. You should have these backups performed on a regular basis, as identified in the security policy, and they should be stored on an off-site. Usually have an on-site and an off-site backup, and that replication between your on-site and off-site backup usually happens over some sort of encrypted medium. You're going to want to do these regularly, which means you should automate them if you can. There's off-the-shelf software you can buy that will allow you to do this, or you can use a variety of different scripts, right, to automate things. But you should perform them regularly. Usually you don't do a full backup every day because they take a lot of time. You tend to do a full backup on a monthly or maybe even weekly, and throughout the interval in between those full backups, you do partial backups of the changed files at least. You should always validate your backups. Make sure they work, right? Test restoring them now and then. Make sure you actually get the data back, because if it doesn't restore, it's totally useless. If you're transporting them off-site and it's over a network, make sure that network's encrypted. Make sure the backups are encrypted, and make sure that that everything's logged properly. They should also be secured using some kind of strong password, and a password that's actually required to restore the data. Because if they're not, someone else can get their hands on that backup, and then you lose your stuff. It's not a good place to be. So new malware is released all the time, and enterprises have to keep current with the latest version of their antivirus software. Usually you install antivirus software on your end devices, right? And keep your systems up to date. Don't let your organization have really old, obsolete, out-of-date operating systems. Make sure you keep your stuff up to date all the time. And install those critical security patches as frequently as you possibly can. You can even set this up to automatically happen. AAA servers, I already talked about these a little bit, right? We're going to go into a bit more depth now. So that's authentication, authorization, and accounting. So it's controlling who is permitted to access your network, authenticate, what they're allowed to do, that's authorize, and make a record of what was done. Accounting, right? The common service you see deployed for this is Microsoft Active Directory. That doesn't have to be the only one. There's Cisco AAA servers. There's Open LDAP, open source implementation that does the same thing. With Active Directory, it's usually in the cloud these days, but you could just straight up use Active Directory. It's pretty much the industry standard for this. Firewalls reside between two or more networks, and they control traffic. They help prevent unauthorized traffic. You could have a firewall to allow outside users access to specific resources internally. This is usually through somewhere separate, referred to as a demilitarized zone. So these are things that require outside access. They usually get segregated off, and that way your network admin can apply specific policies to access to those things, right? Now there's all kinds of firewalls in various different forms. Hardware firewall appliances, software firewalls on your your routers, on your servers. Um, they all the different products work a bit differently, but they all support the following things: packet filtering. So this allows or prevents access based on an IP or MAC address. Application filtering. This will allow you to prevent or allow access based on port numbers. We talked about port numbers earlier. This is why they're important. URL filtering, so you can prevent or allow access to websites based on specific URLs or keywords. And some of the more advanced ones support stateful packet inspection. So this allows the device to look at incoming packets and make sure they're legitimate. And if they're not legitimate, if they're unsolicited packets, they just get blocked. It's pretty great. It can filter out specific types of attacks like a denial of service, right? Just enable this and that's not an issue anymore. Securing your endpoints. Those tend to be your weakest I was going somewhere with that. You're most likely to be compromised, right? Your weakest point in your security. So endpoints are your laptops, devices, desktops, your servers, phones, tablets. Also people, right? Like your weakest point in your entire security policy for your organization is your people, because people will do really dumb things. Like, for example, if you enforce a really strict password policy, your password has to be crazy long and it has to be updated, I don't know, something crazy like every 2 weeks or something like that. People are just gonna write it on a piece of paper and stick it to their monitor, or write it down and take a picture of it on their phone and maybe stick that in the cloud. And then it's even less secure than it was originally, right? So securing your end devices can be one of your most challenging jobs, and people are the most unpredictable thing. So you have to have well-documented security policies. Employees have to be aware of these, and to prevent the password complexity nonsense, make it complex enough but not super complex, and just enable two-factor authentication, because that mitigates against most issues for access anyway. Employees have to be trained on proper use of the network, and they have to be aware of the policy. The policy usually includes antivirus software and host intrusion prevention. Most endpoint security relies on controlling access to the network, your network access control. When it comes to securing your devices, for Cisco devices anyway, you could use Cisco Auto Secure. So this helps you make sure that your settings are not set to oh no, this is defaults that are good. Your security settings are set to default values for new operating systems. You don't want that, right? You don't want the defaults. So for routers specifically, use Cisco Auto Secure, and it'll help you secure the system. Additionally, don't use default usernames and passwords, right? The extreme example of that is Cisco in class in the Cisco literature. And in the Windows, the Microsoft literature, usually it's some variation of password, right? Don't use that when you're configuring an Active Directory domain controller, because that's a bad idea. Access to those resources, or any system resources, should be restricted only to people that are authorized to use them, and only people who actually need access to them. Any unnecessary services you have running and applications, just disable those and remove them if it's possible as well, right? If you don't need a web server running, disable the web server. If you have a web server but you don't need remote access, which is probably unlikely, disable it. If you have remote access set up, use SSH. Don't use Telnet. In fact, block Telnet. Turn off the service. Block the port, because that can be used to do nasty things. Um, Usually when you get new devices too, from a manufacturer, they've been sitting in a warehouse for a while, they haven't been updated, update them and install the security patches before you put them on the network, because otherwise you're just asking for trouble. Passwords, there's a lot of crazy stuff here, but and this gets complicated. The more complex you make your passwords, the more likely somebody's gonna stick it on a sticky note and tape it to their monitor, or take a picture of it on their smartphone and save it in the cloud. Um, Long passwords are great, but also two-factor authentication is even better. Um, Encrypt on Cisco devices specifically. Encrypt plain text passwords by making sure the password encryption service is running. You could set a minimum length for passwords. You can, which I just talked about that a little bit, right? I skipped over that slide because, yeah, having a minimum length is good, but when you make it too crazy long, I don't know. I think it makes your security worse because people do stupid things. But you can block login attempts after a certain number of invalid attempts for a certain amount of time. That's commonly done, right? There's the command for doing that. You can also set your exec mode to timeout after a certain amount of time. So if somebody walks away and forgets to type exit or disconnect from the device, it'll at least it'll kick them out after a certain amount of time. It's a good thing. Disable Telnet. Configure SSH. We should do that anyway, because Telnet is plain text on the internet and SSH is encrypted end-to-end. And when I say Telnet's plain text on the internet, I mean username and password as well. So to enable SSH, you need to give the device a unique host name. Can't have everything be router, because when you're remote accessed into it, which router are you connected to? You have no idea, right? Configure the IP domain name, make it part of a domain, and generate keys, RSA keys, to encrypt your SSH traffic. The nice thing about RSA keys over passwords is they can't be brute forced. Well, they can, but not the same way as passwords, right? They're a little bit more secure because you have to have the key to connect. It's a logical thing in software, but it's kind of like the mentality of a physical thing, because if you don't have that key, you can't get in. You might have a local database with usernames. That's a good idea. You can authenticate against that local database by using the login local configuration command. And enable SSH, disable Telnet, right? We talked about that. Oops, meant to go one more. And finally, disable unused services. I talked about that kind of on devices, but did you know routers have the capability of having a web server? You can run a web server on it. DHCP ports, right? Those are usually open. If you're not using DHCP, disable it, because these can be taken advantage of and exploited for all kinds of things. So you can look at your open ports with show IP ports all, and that'll help. That'll help. Disabling unused services is a great way to secure your systems. And on that, take care, be safe, have a great week. I'll see you in the lab this week. We'll do some more subnetting practice. I'm not going to do any subnetting today because I'm just not. So, have a good night. Talk to you soon. Bye for now. I say night, but it could be day, depending on when you're watching this. Anyway, take care.